In the summer of the year 63 before Christ, the legions of Rome marched toward a city they believed conquered before firing a single arrow. Their standards gleamed beneath the Judean sun. Their battering rams had already been transported from Tyre, and their general, the man who had made the world tremble from Hispania to the Caucasus, watched the walls of the Temple Mount with the patience of one who knows time is on his side. But behind those ramparts, there was no surrender. There was faith, there was desperation. There were thousands of men willing to die before seeing the most sacred place in their world profaned. And then, on a day of rest, when prayers still floated in the air and Jewish hands could not lift offensive swords, Rome attacked. The catapults roared. The battering rams struck like thunder against the ancient stone. Ladders rose against the walls, while arrows and stones fell like black rain. Soldiers climbed, fell, climbed again. Dust mingled with blood. Screams pierced the valley. Priests continued offering sacrifices while death entered through the gates. Some defenders chose to throw themselves into the void rather than witness the profanation. Others died on their knees, praying. And when silence finally fell over the Temple Mount, 12,000 bodies lay among the rubble of a shattered faith. But the greatest profanation was yet to come. A man walked toward the most sacred place on earth, the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest could enter once a year. And that man was no priest, he was Roman. That day, Jerusalem did not merely lose a battle, it lost its independence forever. And the echo of that fall would resonate through the centuries, sowing the seeds of even greater tragedies to come. To understand what happened in Jerusalem that fateful year, it is necessary to go back decades to the golden age of the Hasmonean kingdom. This dynasty had risen from the ashes of the Maccabean revolt, when a handful of devout Jews rose against the Seleucid Empire and reconquered their right to worship their god. For nearly a century, the Hasmoneans had ruled Judea as kings and high priests, maintaining a precarious balance between religious tradition and the demands of Hellenistic politics. But the seeds of destruction lay within the royal family itself. In the year 67 before Christ, Queen Salome Alexandra breathed her last. She had been a wise ruler, capable of maintaining peace between the rival factions of her kingdom, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, whose theological disputes constantly threatened to tear the nation apart. Her death left the throne at the mercy of her two sons, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, two brothers who embodied everything that divided Judea. Hyrcanus was the elder, but also the weaker. His temperament was gentle, his will malleable, and his ambition practically non-existent. The Pharisees supported him, seeing in him a leader they could influence. Aristobulus, on the other hand, was everything his brother was not. Charismatic, violent, reckless, he had the warrior spirit of his father, Alexander Jannaeus. The Sadducees, the priestly aristocracy of the temple, saw him as their champion. Civil war was inevitable. Aristobulus did not wait for his mother to grow cold in her tomb. He gathered his supporters, marched against Jerusalem, and defeated his brother near Jericho. Many of Hyrcanus's soldiers deserted upon seeing Aristobulus's determination. Hyrcanus, overwhelmed, accepted a humiliating agreement. He renounced both the throne and the high priesthood in exchange for preserving his life and living in peace. But peace was an illusion. Behind Hyrcanus rose a shadow far more dangerous than any king. His name was Antipater the Idumean, and his ambition knew no bounds. The Idumeans were a people who had been forcibly converted to Judaism barely 2 generations earlier, and many Jews considered them foreigners, upstarts, false believers. Antipater had not forgotten that disdain. He had devoted his life to accumulating power, influence, and alliances, waiting for the right moment to seize Judea. That moment had arrived. Antipater convinced Hyrcanus that his brother was planning to assassinate him. Fear is a powerful weapon, and Hyrcanus, weak and insecure, fell into his hands like clay in a potter's grasp. Antipater persuaded him to flee to Petra, the spectacular city carved into pink rock that served as the capital of the Nabatean kingdom. There, under the protection of King Aretas III, Hyrcanus would find the allies he needed to reclaim his throne. The negotiations were swift. In exchange for territorial concessions, Aretas provided Hyrcanus with an army of 50,000 men. Nabatean cavalry and infantry crossed the borders of Judea like an avalanche, defeating Aristobulus's forces and pushing him toward Jerusalem. Soon, the usurper king found himself besieged on the Temple Mount, surrounded by his enemies, while his own people divided between both sides. But while the Jewish brothers tore each other apart, a far greater shadow loomed over the east. Rome had awakened. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus was, in the year 64 before Christ, the most powerful man in the known world. He was not emperor, for Rome still called itself a republic, but his power exceeded that of any magistrate. He had crushed the pirates who plagued the Mediterranean in barely 3 months. He had defeated the fearsome Mithridates of Pontus, Rome's most persistent enemy in a generation. He had conquered Armenia, crossed the Caucasus, and established Roman dominion from the shores of the Black Sea to the sands of Syria. Now, while wintering in Damascus, organizing the new province of Syria, news arrived of the chaos in Judea. 3 delegations presented themselves before Pompey. Hyrcanus sent Antipater with promises of loyalty and cooperation. Aristobulus sent emissaries laden with gold, including a golden vine weighing 800 kilograms that Pompey would send to the Temple of Jupiter in Rome. A 3rd delegation, sent by the Sanhedrin itself, asked for something different: that Rome eliminate both brothers and allow Judea to govern itself as a theocratic republic. Pompey listened to everyone with the calculating patience that characterized him. He saw in this dispute a golden opportunity. A divided kingdom was a weak kingdom, and a weak kingdom was easy to absorb. He decided to postpone his decision until he personally arrived in Judea. But Aristobulus was not willing to await the judgment of a pagan. The Hasmonean king left Damascus without permission and took refuge in the fortress of Alexandrium, preparing to resist. This insolence enraged Pompey. No one defied the conqueror of the East. No one turned their back on him. The Roman legions, rested and victorious, after years of campaigns, turned south. The fate of Judea was sealed. Aristobulus attempted to negotiate, surrendered Alexandrium, promised to hand over Jerusalem. But when Pompey's legates arrived at the Holy City, Aristobulus's supporters shut the gates on them. The temple fortress would remain in Jewish hands. Pompey did not tolerate the affront. He ordered Aristobulus arrested and marched toward Jerusalem with his legions. Jerusalem in the year 63 before Christ was a city split in 2. The followers of Hyrcanus, who controlled the lower city and the royal palace, opened their gates to Pompey without resistance. They believed the Romans came to restore their rightful lord, not to conquer. They did not understand that for Rome there were no allies, only subjects who did not yet know it. But the Temple Mount was another story. Aristobulus's supporters, mostly Sadducees, priests and warriors who saw Rome as an existential threat to their faith, entrenched themselves in the sacred precinct. They destroyed the bridge connecting the temple to the city, cutting off all communication. They reinforced the walls, they stored water and provisions, and they swore to defend the holiest place on earth until their last breath. Pompey studied the terrain with an expert eye. To the south and east, deep valleys made any assault impossible. To the west, the Jews had destroyed the access. Only the north remained, where a depression in the terrain offered the only viable approach. Protected by the citadel known as the Barris, The Roman general ordered siege works constructed. His engineers filled the ditch, protecting the northern approach, while the defenders launched projectiles from above. But Pompey had observed something crucial about his enemies: their piety. The Jews observed the Sabbath with rigorous devotion. From sunset on Friday until nightfall on Saturday, all work was forbidden, including the work of war. They could defend themselves if directly attacked, but they could not initiate combat or perform labors such as demolishing siege works. Pompey ordered all construction work to be carried out on the day of rest. Week after week, the earthworks grew, while the defenders watched helplessly, unable to act without violating their sacred law. Some rabbis pleaded that attacking be permitted, that the survival of the temple justified any exception. But tradition prevailed. The law was the law, and the law was killing them. Meanwhile, inside the sacred precinct, the priests continued their duties, as if the world were not crumbling around them. Every morning and every evening, sacrifices were offered. Incense ascended toward heaven. Prayers echoed in the courtyards. It was an image of absolute defiance, of unshakable faith, of men who preferred to die fulfilling their sacred duty rather than surrender. 3 months the siege lasted. 3 months of Roman construction, of Jewish waiting, of unbearable tension. The battering rams that Pompey had ordered, brought from Tyre, finally arrived. The siege towers were assembled, the catapults were positioned, and then the day came. It was Sabbath when Pompey gave the order to assault. The roar of war machines shattered the sacred silence of the day of rest. The battering rams struck the walls with devastating force, each impact resonating like the heartbeat of a furious god. The catapults hurled enormous stones that whistled through the air before crashing against the defenses. Roman soldiers, disciplined and thirsting for victory after months of waiting, advanced in perfect formations toward the ramparts. The first man to scale the wall was Faustus Cornelius Sulla, son of the former Roman dictator. His name was an omen of what was to come. Behind him climbed the centurions Furius and Fabius, each leading a cohort of veterans hardened by years of war in the East. The Jewish defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew they were lost. Swords clashed against swords. Blood soaked the sacred stone. Some priests died holding their ritual instruments, refusing to abandon their duties even in the face of death. Other soldiers, unable to bear the profanation that was coming, threw themselves from the walls into the valley, preferring death by their own choice to witnessing defeat. The Romans entered from the north, through the Barris citadel, and from the west simultaneously. The defenders were trapped, without escape, without hope. What followed was not a battle. It was a massacre. 12,000 Jews died that day. 12,000 bodies lay scattered across the courtyards that generations of pilgrims had walked. Blood ran down the steps where Levites once sang psalms. The din of metal and the screams of the dying replaced prayers. When silence finally fell over the Temple Mount, the air was thick with the smell of iron and death. Roman soldiers, sweaty and stained with blood, regrouped among the debris. Some looked around in confusion at men who did not understand why these foreigners had fought so fiercely for a building. And then Pompey walked toward the temple. His officers followed in reverent silence. They crossed the court of the Gentiles, where any non-Jew could enter. They passed the barrier separating pagans from sacred space, ignoring the inscriptions, warning of death to any Gentile who passed. They entered the court of women, then the court of Israel. Each step was a greater transgression than the one before. Finally, Pompey stopped before the entrance to the Sancta Sanctorum, the Holy of Holies. This was the heart of Judaism, the place where tradition said God's presence dwelled on earth. Only the high priest could enter, and only once a year on Yom Kippur, covered by a cloud of incense that would prevent him from seeing directly what lay within. No other human being had crossed that threshold in centuries. Pompey crossed it. What he found inside bewildered him. There were no statues, No images of gods, like in the Greek or Roman temples he knew. Only an empty space, austere, sacred in its absolute simplicity. The Jews worshipped an invisible God, a God who could not be represented, who dwelled in absence rather than presence. The Roman general stood motionless for a long moment, trying to comprehend what he saw, or rather, what he did not see. Then he turned and left. But the profanation was done. The most sacred place on Jewish earth had been violated by pagan feet. The news would spread throughout the Jewish world like a spiritual earthquake, sowing bitterness, hatred, and desires for vengeance that would take generations to manifest. Yet Pompey also demonstrated a strange restraint. He did not touch any of the temple's treasures, the golden menorah, the sacred vessels, the offerings accumulated over decades. All remained in place. Some sources say there were more than 2,000 talents of silver in the treasury chambers. Pompey did not take a single coin. The next day, he ordered the temple cleansed and the sacrifices resumed. The surviving priests, stunned and traumatized, obeyed. It was as if Rome wanted to demonstrate that it had not come to destroy the Jewish religion, only to conquer their land. But the damage was done. The message was clear. Rome could enter wherever it wished, profane whatever it desired, and pardon when it suited. The God of the Jews had not protected his sanctuary, or perhaps some whispered he had abandoned them for their sins. What followed was the systematic dismantling of the Hasmonean kingdom. Pompey reinstated Hyrcanus as high priest, but stripped him of the title of king. Judea retained some autonomy, but was forced to pay tribute and became subject to Roman administration in Syria. The kingdom was carved up. It lost the Mediterranean coast, depriving it of access to the sea. It lost parts of Idumea and Samaria. Several Hellenistic cities were liberated to form the Decapolis. Aristobulus was chained and sent to Rome along with his sons Alexander and Antigonus, to march in Pompey's triumphal procession. Many other Jewish prisoners were transported to the capital of the world, where they would form the nucleus of the Roman Jewish community, the oldest in Europe. As for Antipater the Idumean, the true winner of this tragedy, he had achieved exactly what he wanted. Hyrcanus was now a puppet without real power, completely dependent on his advisor. Antipater became the strongman of Judea, the indispensable intermediary between the Jews and their new Roman masters. His son, Herod, would inherit his ambition and methods, and one day would sit on the throne of Jerusalem as king, though Jewish only in name. Pompey returned to Rome as the conqueror of the Eastern world. His triumph was the greatest the city had ever seen, celebrated over 2 full days. Among the nations listed in his procession appeared Judea, reduced to one more name on the long list of peoples subjected to the Roman eagle. The siege of Jerusalem in the year 63 before Christ marked the end of Jewish independence that had begun with the Maccabees a century before. But more than that, it initiated a period of foreign domination that would define Jewish history for the next 2 millennia. The Romans who entered that day could not imagine the consequences of their conquest. 133 years later, another Roman general named Titus would besiege this same city. But unlike Pompey, he would show no restraint. The Second Temple would be reduced to ashes, and with it, an entire era of Jewish history. The diaspora that followed would scatter the Jewish people to the 4 corners of the world. And it all began here, on a Sabbath in the summer of 63, when a Roman general crossed the threshold that no Gentile should cross, and the world changed forever. Historians would later call this event the end of the Second Temple era in its independent form. Historian Nadav Sharon identified Pompey's conquest as a watershed moment in Jewish history. the beginning of a transitional period in which Judea began to experience semi-diasporic conditions, with foreign rule generating structural changes that would reshape Jewish society. These changes laid the groundwork for the survival of Jewish life after the destruction of the temple in the year 70 of our era. Synagogues, which until then had been secondary meeting places, would become the center of religious life. The study of the Torah would gradually replace sacrifices as the primary form of worship. Rabbinic Judaism, which would emerge from the ashes of Jerusalem, would carry in its spiritual DNA the memory of this first fall. Today, more than 2,000 years later, the Western Wall is all that remains of the Second Temple complex. Millions of pilgrims each year press their hands against those ancient stones, whispering prayers and slipping notes into the cracks. Many of them do not know that those same walls witnessed the day when Pompey the Great walked where no pagan should walk. But the stones remember. The stones always remember. And if one listens carefully enough in the stillness of a Jerusalem night, perhaps one can hear the echo of those 12,000 men who died defending what they loved most. An echo that crosses the centuries, reminding us that some battles are lost but never forgotten. Because on that summer day in the year 63 before Christ, Rome conquered Jerusalem. But Jerusalem, in some mysterious way, also conquered the world. Its faith, its memory, its refusal to disappear survived Rome, survived Byzantium, survived the caliphates and the crusaders, the empires and the persecutions. Pompey's sword rusted away millennia ago. The legions that marched over the Temple Mount are dust. But the prayers that rose that day are still recited in synagogues around the world. And that, perhaps, is the greatest victory of all.